The morning sun had barely peeped through the diner's dusty windows when May wiped down the counter for the 100th time that day. The smell of burnt coffee and greasy bacon hung in the air, mixing with the lingering scent of cleaning solution. She'd been on her feet since 5 a.m., and her blue uniform dress, though freshly pressed this morning, now felt as tired as she did. "Order up." The cook's voice boomed from the kitchen, making her jump slightly. She grabbed the plates, expertly balancing them along her arm, a skill perfected over 15 years of serving. Pancakes for table 4, eggs over easy for the businessman in the corner who always typed furiously on his laptop, and toast for the elderly couple who split everything they ordered. The day had started like any other, but something felt different. Maybe it was the way her reflection caught her eye as she passed the chrome coffee maker. Dark circles under her eyes, hair escaping from what had been a neat bun this morning. Or perhaps it was the weight of her notepad in her pocket, filled with customer orders but empty of the dreams she used to sketch during slow afternoons. "Miss, this coffee is cold." A sharp voice cut through her thoughts. The man in the pressed suit held up his cup like it was evidence in a trial. She could see his expensive watch glinting under his sleeve, probably worth more than she made in 3 months. "I'm so sorry, sir. Let me get you a fresh cup right away." Her voice came out steady, practiced, the same tone she'd used thousands of times before. But as she turned to grab the coffee pot, her manager's voice stopped her. "Is there a problem here?" Mr. Lee appeared, his tie perfectly straight as always. He had that look on his face, the one that said the customer was always right, even when they weren't. "This young lady served me cold coffee. In all my years coming to diners, I'd never experienced such poor service." The man's voice carried across the restaurant, making other customers look up from their meals. May stood there, coffee pot in hand, feeling smaller with each word. She wanted to explain that she'd just poured that coffee 3 minutes ago, that she'd checked the temperature herself because she always did. Instead, she watched as Mr. Lee apologized profusely, offered the man a free meal, and then turned to her with disappointment written across his face. "We need to talk about your performance," he said quietly, but not quietly enough. She could feel the other servers watching, could almost hear their whispers. Some of them had been here when she started, had watched her work double shifts when her mom got sick, had seen her slowly give up on those community college classes she used to rush to after work. In the bathroom, later, she stared at her reflection. A streak of mascara had made its way down her cheek. When had she started crying? The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, harsh and unforgiving, making every line on her face stand out. 32 years old, and what did she have to show for it? She thought about the half-finished business degree tucked away in her drawer at home, the one she'd abandoned when medical bills started piling up. She remembered how proud her mom had been when she got that scholarship, how everyone in their small community had said she was going places. The bathroom door squeaked open, and she quickly wiped her eyes. But instead of another server or customer, it was Mrs. Wu, one of her regular morning customers who always ordered chamomile tea and toast with no butter. "You okay, dear?" Mrs. Wu's kind eyes met hers in the mirror. "I saw what happened out there. Some people forget there's a human being behind the uniform." That's when something inside Mai broke, or maybe it was something finally clicking into place. She'd spent so long trying to be invisible, efficient, the perfect server who never complained and always smiled. But she wasn't just a waitress, was she? She was a daughter who'd put her family first, a student who'd had dreams, a woman who still had time to become something more. The tears came again, but this time they felt different. Like rain washing away dust, revealing something underneath that had been there all along, just waiting to shine. The next morning arrived with a gentle drizzle that made the diner's windows fog up. Mai arrived early, as usual, watching the streetlights fade as dawn crept in. She tied her apron with practiced movements, trying to shake off yesterday's humiliation. The morning regulars would be arriving soon, and she needed to focus. The bell of the door chimed, and Mrs. Wu shuffled in, looking more tired than usual. She made her way to her usual spot, the third booth from the window, where the morning light wasn't too harsh on her eyes. But something was different today. Her hands trembled more than usual as she reached for the menu she'd memorized years ago. The usual, Mrs. Wu, chamomile tea and toast, Mai asked, already reaching for the notepad in her pocket. But she stopped when she noticed Mrs. Wu's eyes, red-rimmed and worried. Just the tea today, dear. Mrs. Wu's voice was barely above a whisper. She fumbled with her purse, coins spilling across the table. Mai watched as the elderly woman's fingers, swollen with arthritis, struggled to count out the exact change. Something clicked in Mai's mind. She'd seen Mrs. Wu here every morning for the past 3 years, always ordering the same modest breakfast. The older woman had been there through Mai's own rough patches, offering quiet words of encouragement when she noticed Mai's exhaustion. "Let me help you with that," Mai said softly, reaching for the scattered coins. As she gathered them, she noticed the prescription receipt poking out of Mrs. Wu's purse. The numbers on it made her heart sink. "The medicine costs went up again," Mrs. Wu explained, attempting a brave smile. Something had to give, and well, she gestured at the menu she wasn't going to order from. Without thinking twice, Mai turned toward the kitchen. "One moment, please." She returned minutes later with a tray carrying not just tea, but also toast with a side of fresh fruit, technically her own employee meal for the day. "Oh, I can't," Mrs. Wu protested, but Mai was already setting down the plates. "It's already made," she said firmly. "Can't let it go to waste, right?" She watched as relief and gratitude washed over Mrs. Wu's face, and something stirred inside her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Throughout her shift, Mai found herself paying closer attention to her customers. There was the young student who nursed a single coffee for hours while studying, his textbook held together with tape. The construction worker who always tipped generously despite his worn work boots. The single mom who brought her kids in for a special breakfast once a month, counting quarters carefully. They weren't just orders to fill or tables to clean. They were stories, lives intersecting with hers in this small, steam-filled space. She'd been so caught up in her own shame, her own feeling of being stuck, that she'd forgotten something important. She wasn't just serving food, she was part of people's daily lives. During the lunch rush, a new customer snapped his fingers to get her attention, treating her like she was invisible. But this time, instead of shrinking inside, Mai stood taller. She thought of Mrs. Wu's dignity in the face of hardship, of all the quiet struggles and small victories she witnessed every day. "I'll be with you in just a moment, sir," she said, her voice clear and confident. She finished helping an elderly man cut his sandwich into manageable pieces first, something not listed in her job description, but important nonetheless. As she filled coffee cups and cleared tables, Mai began to see her job differently. Every interaction was a chance to make someone's day a little better, every moment an opportunity to be the kind of person Mrs. Wu had been to her, someone who saw the human behind the uniform. By the end of her shift, her feet ached as usual, but her heart felt lighter. She'd spent years feeling ashamed of being just a waitress, but maybe the shame had been misplaced. There was value in what she did, dignity in doing it well, and wisdom to be gained from the people she served. Looking at her reflection in the diner's window as she left that evening, Mai saw something new in her own eyes, a spark of purpose, a glimmer of possibility. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing. She was done letting others define her worth. Sunday brunch at the diner was always chaos, but this particular morning felt like a storm had hit the kitchen. The head cook had called in sick, leaving only 2 inexperienced cooks to handle the weekend rush. The line of tickets grew longer, and the mumbling from waiting customers grew louder. Mai could feel the tension building as she rushed between tables, offering extra coffee and apologies. Her shoes squeaked against the floor as she pivoted between demanding customers and frustrated kitchen staff. 15 years of watching the kitchen work had taught her the rhythm of this dance. She could practically hear when an order was about to go wrong. Through the service window, she spotted one of the new cooks struggling with multiple orders. Eggs were starting to brown at the edges, hash browns were on the verge of burning, and toast was piling up with no one coordinating the plates. Without thinking, Mai pushed through the kitchen's swinging door. The heat hit her face like a wall, along with the sizzle of grills and the sharp scent of onions. "Let me help," she said, grabbing plates and starting to arrange them. Her hands moved automatically, placing eggs just so, adding the garnish she'd seen done 1,000 times before. The young cook looked at her with surprise but didn't object. Mai had spent countless hours watching the regular cooks work while waiting for orders. She'd absorbed more than she realized. How they timed different items to finish together, how they arranged plates to make simple food look appealing. She reached for the over-easy eggs just as they reached perfection, plated them alongside golden brown hash browns, and added a sprig of parsley, just like she'd seen the regular cook do hundreds of times. At home, she always played with plating her own simple meals, making them look special even when they were just leftovers. "You've got a good eye," said the kitchen manager, who had been quietly watching. He'd worked there even longer than May, his white apron bearing the badges of countless busy shifts. Most servers don't know how to plate like that. Mai felt her cheeks warm, but she kept working. "I just pay attention," she said, adding a perfect triangle of toast to complete the plate. But it was more than that. She could feel when food was ready just by the sound and smell, could tell when a dish needed a little extra something to make it special. As the rush continued, May found herself moving between serving and helping in the kitchen. Her feet ached and sweat dampened her collar, but something felt different. In the kitchen, there was no time for shame or self-doubt. There was only the next plate, the next order, the satisfaction of sending out food that looked as good as it tasted. During a brief lull, she caught her reflection in the steel of the prep counter. Her face was flushed, her hair was coming loose, and there was a smudge of flour on her cheek. But her eyes were bright, alive in a way they hadn't been in years. A customer stopped her later, pointing to his empty plate. Her heart sank, expecting another complaint. Instead, he smiled. "Best breakfast I've had here in months," he said. Everything was perfect, even the presentation. That evening, as she counted her tips, the kitchen manager approached her. "You know," he said, leaning against the counter, "we could use someone with your eye for detail back there. Ever thought about learning to cook professionally?" Mai had opened her mouth to say no, to explain that she was just a waitress, that she couldn't possibly. But the words stopped in her throat. She thought about how natural it had felt in the kitchen, how time had flown by when she was helping plate the food, how, for the first time in years, she'd felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. I wouldn't know where to start," she admitted, but her voice held a note of curiosity rather than defeat. "There's a community college program," he said, sliding a brochure across the counter. "Same one I did 20 years ago. Classes are in the evening." He tapped the paper with one finger. "Just something to think about." Mai tucked the brochure into her apron pocket. That night, instead of feeling exhausted by the long shift, she felt energized. In her tiny apartment kitchen, she opened her favorite cookbook, the one she'd found at a garage sale years ago, its pages now stained and dog-eared. She'd always told herself it was just for fun, just a hobby. But maybe, just maybe, it could be more than that. The community college hallway felt strange and familiar all at once. May clutched her enrollment papers, her hands still smelling faintly of dish soap from her morning shift. She'd forgotten how intimidating schools could be. All those young faces rushing past, while she stood there in her waitress uniform, trying not to feel out of place. Every tip she'd earned in the past month was going toward these evening culinary classes. The brochure had stayed in her apron pocket for 2 weeks before she finally gathered the courage to fill out the application. Now, watching students filter into the culinary classroom, She wondered if she'd made a mistake. First time. A woman about her age stood next to her, also in work clothes. She introduced herself as a grocery store clerk who dreamed of opening a bakery. Something in her nervous smile made Mai feel less alone. The classroom itself was nothing like she'd imagined. Instead of regular desks, there were stainless steel workstations. The walls held racks of gleaming pots and pans, and the air smelled of fresh herbs and possibility. Their instructor, a gray-haired chef with kind eyes, started the class by asking everyone to share their favorite food memory. Mai thought of watching her grandmother fold dumplings, the way her wrinkled hands moved with such precision, such love. When it was her turn to speak, her voice shook only a little. That first evening flew by. They learned about knife safety, about the importance of mise en place, having everything in its place before you start cooking. Mai's hands, used to carrying plates and wiping tables, found new purpose in chopping onions and mincing garlic. But reality had a way of creeping in. After class, her feet ached from standing another 3 hours after her regular 8-hour shift. The bus ride home took 45 minutes, and she had to be up at 4 a.m. for the breakfast shift. Some of her coworkers snickered when they saw her studying recipe books during her breaks. "Getting too fancy for us now?" one of them asked, not unkindly, but with an edge that suggested she should know her place. Mrs. Wu, though, became her biggest cheerleader. "You bring that homework here," she'd say, patting the seat across from her during slow moments. "I'll quiz you on those fancy French words." The real test came 3 weeks into the course. Mai had saved exactly enough for next month's tuition when her ancient coffee maker died, the one she relied on for those early morning wake-ups. That same day, a customer left without paying their bill, which would come out of her tips. Standing in the kitchen supply store after class, Mai stared at the price tags on coffee makers, doing mental math. Buy the coffee maker or stay in school. Her decision was made when she remembered the night before, how proud she'd felt when her instructor praised her knife skills. She bought the cheapest coffee maker they had and picked up extra shifts on weekends. Sleep became a luxury, and her tiny apartment grew dusty from neglect. But something was changing. She started experimenting with the diner's plain dishes, adding little touches she learned in class. A sprig of fresh herb here, a different plating technique there. Customers noticed. Orders for her sections increased. Even Mr. Lee, the manager who'd once scolded her over cold coffee, started asking her opinion on daily specials. One evening, rushing from work to class, Mai caught her reflection in a store window. Her uniform was wrinkled, there were dark circles under her eyes, and her recipe books were threatening to spill from her oversized bag. But she stood straighter than she had in years. A group of business people in suits pushed past her on the sidewalk, reminding her of the customer who'd complained about cold coffee months ago. But this time, instead of feeling small, she felt something different: pride. They might be wearing expensive clothes, but she was building something valuable, one lesson at a time. In class that night, they learned about sauces, the 5 mother sauces that formed the foundation of French cuisine. As Mai whisked her first bechamel into silky smoothness, she realized something. She wasn't just learning recipes, she was learning a new language. A language of flavors and techniques that had been waiting for her all along, hidden behind the diner's swinging doors. The sound hit her before she saw it. A horrible grinding noise from under the hood of her old car. Mai gripped the steering wheel tighter, watching steam rise from the engine as she managed to pull into a gas station. She was already running late for her morning shift, and a mechanic's words would only make her day worse. "Head gasket's blown," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Looking at about 1,200 to fix it." He might as well have said 1,000,000. That was exactly the amount she'd saved for next semester's tuition. The bus ride to work was long and quiet. Mai watched raindrops race down the window, each one feeling like another dream sliding away. Her course instructor had just praised her perfect chicken piccata the night before, saying she had real talent. Now, Sitting on the crowded bus, that compliment felt like it belonged to someone else. The diner was busy when she arrived, 30 minutes late. Mr. Lee gave her a stern look, but softened when she explained about the car. "Take table 12," he said, nodding toward a group of well-dressed business people having a breakfast meeting. She approached the table, notepad ready, professional smile in place. One of the men looked up, his expensive watch glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Well, if it isn't the culinary student," he said with a smirk. It was a regular from the morning crowd who'd overheard her talking to Mrs. Wu about her classes. "Just a waitress today," May replied quietly, pen poised to take their order. "And probably forever," he chuckled to his colleagues. "Some people should know their place." The words hit harder than usual. Maybe because of the car, maybe because she'd been up since 4 a.m. studying sauce recipes, or maybe because her hands still smelled of garlic from last night's class. She felt something hot and tight build in her chest. But then she noticed Mrs. Wu at her usual table watching. The elderly woman gave her a small nod, the kind that said more than words could. Mai straightened her spine. "Your orders, please," she said, her voice steady. She wouldn't let them see her shake. During her break, she sat in the back alley, calculator in hand. The numbers wouldn't add up, no matter how she moved them around. Bus fare, rent, tuition, groceries, something had to give. Her phone buzzed with a text from her culinary instructor about an upcoming practical exam on classic French techniques. The easy thing would be to quit. Go back to just being a waitress, like that man said. No more late nights studying. No more struggling to keep her eyes open during morning shifts. No more stretching every dollar until it screamed. She pulled out her textbook, the pages now stained with various sauces and marked with countless sticky notes. Opening to the chapter on mother sauces, she ran her finger down the familiar list. Each recipe represented hours of practice, burns on her arms, and small victories when she finally got it right. That evening, after her shift, she took a detour before heading to class. The pawn shop's lights were harsh, but the owner was kind. Her TV, barely used anyway since she started school, would cover about a quarter of the car repairs. Her grandmother's gold bracelet. That was harder to let go, but it would help bridge the gap. She sold her coffee maker too, replacing it with a cheap plastic pour-over cone. Each morning, she'd have to heat water in a pan, wait patiently for the coffee to drip through. More time, more effort, but that seemed to be the theme of her life now. In class that night, they were learning about perseverance in the kitchen. How to recover when a sauce breaks. How to save a dish that seems ruined. May's hands moved steadily as she whisked her hollandaise, watching the eggs and butter come together into something smooth and beautiful. The secret, her instructor said, walking past, is knowing that setbacks are part of the process. It's not about never failing. It's about what you do when things go wrong. May thought about her empty wrist where her grandmother's bracelet used to be, about the long bus rides ahead, about the man who thought she should know her place. She looked down at her perfect hollandaise sauce, glowing golden under the kitchen lights. Maybe her place wasn't what others thought it should be. Maybe her place was exactly where she was right now, learning, growing, and refusing to give up, one sauce at a time. The local food festival transformed the city park into a maze of white tents and cooking stations. Mai stood behind a small table, wearing her culinary school's apron, offering samples of the classic French dishes she'd learned to make. The spring breeze carried the mingled scents of 100 different cuisines, from traditional dumplings to wood-fired pizzas. Her hands moved automatically, plating tiny portions of coq au vin on sample plates, each one arranged just so. 3 months of taking the bus everywhere had left her with extra time to practice her plating techniques, and it showed. People stopped, not just to taste, but to admire how beautiful each sample looked. "This is amazing," said a woman, closing her eyes as she tasted the dish. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Mai felt a flutter of pride as she explained about her evening classes, about learning classic techniques while working full-time. She didn't mention the pawn jewelry or the endless bus rides. Those were just part of the journey. "You've got great attention to detail," the woman said, taking a business card from May's display. "My catering company could use someone like you for weekend events." Weekend work meant extra money for school, and more importantly, more experience. May tucked the card carefully into her apron pocket, right next to her bus pass. As the afternoon crowd thinned, she noticed a familiar face approaching her booth. The head chef from her old diner, the one who'd first noticed her plating skills during that chaotic Sunday brunch, was now wearing the logo of a new restaurant downtown. "So this is where you disappeared to," he said, sampling her coq au vin. "I heard you'd started culinary school, but I didn't expect." He gestured at the perfectly plated samples. "I'm still waitressing," May said quickly. "Just at a different diner now. The hours work better with my classes." The chef nodded, taking another sample. "You know, I've got my own place now. Small, but it's mine." He paused, watching her arrange another plate with the same care she'd give a fine dining establishment. "I need a line cook who understands both sides of the kitchen, someone who knows food and knows service." May's heart jumped, but then reality set in. "I'm still learning," she said. "I haven't even finished my courses." "You've got 15 years of restaurant experience," he countered. "That's worth more than you think. And from what I'm tasting, you've got the talent to back it up." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through photos of a cozy-looking restaurant with exposed brick walls. "Pays less than you make in tips right now, but there's room to grow. Could lead to sous chef position down the line." A group of customers approached, and Mai automatically shifted into service mode, explaining the dish with the same warmth she used at the diner. The chef watched how she handled them, how she adjusted her explanations based on their questions and interest levels. "See?" he said after they left. "That's what I'm talking about. You understand people, not just food. Think about it." He handed her his card. "Kitchen's yours to run with, if you want it." That evening, sitting on the bus heading to her night class, Mai held both business cards, the catering company and the restaurant. The bus driver hit a pothole, and her tired feet reminded her of double shifts and endless hours standing. She thought about her tiny apartment, the carefully balanced budget that let her stay in school. Taking a lower-paying kitchen job seemed crazy. Her practical side screamed about rent and bus fare and tuition payments. But as the city lights blurred past the window, she remembered something her cooking instructor had said about taking risks in the kitchen. Sometimes you have to let go of the safe choice to make something extraordinary. The bus stopped at a red light next to the restaurant from the chef's photos. Through the window, she could see the warm glow of the dining room, the open kitchen where cooks moved with purpose. She imagined herself there, not carrying plates, but creating the food that went on them. In her mind, she heard that businessman's voice from months ago, "Just a waitress." But now those words had lost their sting. She wasn't just anything. She was a cook, a student, a professional who'd worked her way up from carrying plates to creating dishes that made people close their eyes in pleasure. The light turned green, and the bus moved on. But May's mind stayed in that kitchen, imagining the possibilities. Sometimes moving forward meant taking a step that looked like going backward to everyone else. Sometimes it meant trusting that you were ready, even when your bank account suggested otherwise. The kitchen tiles felt different under her feet now. 1 year had passed since Mai had taken that leap of faith, trading her serving apron for chef's whites. The morning light filtered through the restaurant's windows as she checked the prep lists for the day, her knife roll tucked securely under her arm. A graduation present to herself after completing her culinary program. She paused at the gleaming prep station, running her fingers along the edge she'd cleaned to perfection the night before. The morning quiet before service was her favorite time, when possibility hung in the air like the scent of fresh herbs and brewing coffee. A commotion from the dining room interrupted her morning routine. A young server burst through the kitchen doors, her hands shaking slightly as she clutched an order pad. The customer at table 7 says their eggs are too cold, and they're really angry, and Mai saw her younger self in the server's anxious eyes, remembered that feeling of being small and powerless. But now she stood differently, moved differently. "Let's handle this together," she said, adjusting her chef's coat. They walked to the dining room together, May's clogs clicking against the floor with purpose. The angry customer looked up, ready for confrontation, but paused when he saw May's confident stance and professional whites. "I understand there's an issue with your breakfast," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority she developed over the past year. "I'd be happy to make you fresh eggs exactly how you'd like them." The customer blinked, perhaps expecting an argument or excuses. Instead, he got solutions and respect. "Over medium," he said, his anger deflating slightly. "And hot, please." Back in the kitchen, May showed the young server how to check plate temperature, how to time the toast to arrive with perfectly hot eggs. "Every complaint is a chance to make things better," she explained, the words feeling familiar on her tongue. As she worked, her mind drifted to the changes of the past year. The first few months had been harder than she'd imagined. Learning to live on a line cook's salary meant more sacrifices, a smaller apartment, careful budgeting, picking up catering gigs on her days off. But each shift in the kitchen taught her something new. Each challenge made her stronger. The regular customers had started asking for her by name, not because she served them, but because they loved her food. Her signature dish, a fusion of French techniques and her grandmother's recipes, had become the restaurant's most popular special. A delivery truck arrived, and May went to check the produce order. She remembered Mrs. Wu's words from long ago about seeing the human being behind the uniform. Now she made sure to learn the names of every delivery person, server, and dishwasher. They were all part of the dance that made a restaurant work. During the lunch rush, she moved with practiced efficiency, calling orders, expediting plates, teaching newer cooks the tricks she'd learned. Her hands bore small burns and calluses now, badges of honor in this world of fire and steel. A familiar face appeared at the pass, Mrs. Wu, guided by the young server from earlier. The elderly woman's eyes crinkled with pride as she watched May command her kitchen. "I knew you had it in you, dear," she said, patting May's hand across the counter. May plated Mrs. Wu's lunch herself, adding an extra flourish of fresh herbs and a special sauce she'd been perfecting. As she watched her old friend enjoy the meal, she caught her reflection in the polished surface of the expo station. The woman looking back wasn't just a waitress, wasn't just a cook, wasn't just anything. She was every early morning bus ride, every late-night study session, every sacrifice and triumph that had brought her here. Her chef's coat, though spattered with the day's work, felt like armor, not hiding who she was, but announcing it to the world. The young server approached again, this time with questions about the timing of dessert orders. May smiled, remembering how many questions she'd had when she first started cooking. "Watch," she said, moving to the dessert station. "The secret is in the details." As she demonstrated the perfect caramel swirl, May realized that her journey hadn't been about leaving her waitressing days behind. It had been about gathering every experience, every lesson, every moment of doubt and triumph, and turning them into something beautiful. Just like the dishes she now created, she was a combination of countless ingredients: determination, fear, hope, hard work, and most importantly, the courage to believe she could be more than others said she was. The shame that had once weighed her down had transformed into something else entirely: pride in how far she'd come, and excitement for where she might go next.